Hello, welcome to A Bit Lit. Thank you very much for joining me today. Would you like to start by telling me a bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. My name's Sarah O'Malley. I currently work as a lecturer in critical cultural studies in Mahidol University in Bangkok, in part of their international college, so all teaching in English, not in Thai. I started that post in January 2019, which was just after I'd done my viva for my PhD, which was at the University of Nottingham. So it was quite a kind of rapid transition from PhD life
Wow,
to
yeah.
lecturing life in Bangkok. But it's a really, really interesting. I've been teaching a bit at the University of Nottingham when I was doing my PhD, so it's been a really interesting kind of comparison, different kinds of teaching, different kind of students. So it's been a really good, yeah, I really enjoy it. So that's what I'm doing at the moment.
Wonderful. And what are you researching at the moment?
So at the moment, I'm still really building on the research I did for my thesis, for my PhD. I'm trying to turn that into a couple of articles and hopefully a book. So the kind of core argument, I guess, of my thesis and the research I did for that was arguing for the kind of quite fundamental impact that the New World colonial project, to use perhaps too nice of a word to describe it, but the kind of New World colonial project had on how English people understood their relationship to the spaces that they inhabit, and also how those spaces and those relationships were represented in literature at the time. And I've just finished working on an article that looked at the Jamestown Massacre, as it was called at the time, but perhaps more a better word would be maybe uprising, which was in 1622, where about 350 English colonists were killed in their homes and in their fields. And I looked at how that really impacted how the home was understood and how it was represented on stage. And I looked at that in The City Madam. And I'm now moving on to look at agrarian spaces and a new way to pay old debts. So that's the next piece of work.
That sounds
But the kind of
fascinating.
it's space, like literary geography's space. That's the kind of core part of my research, and really how the New World project influenced that.
That's so interesting. And so could you say a bit more about how those ideas of the uprising and ideas about the home as a space of vulnerability versus a space of safety, or the way that that interacted with acts of violence? Could you say a bit more about how that's affected your conception of what the home meant at the period?
So I think, I mean, the home, I guess, was seen as a sort of foundation for social order, really, a really important building block in the kind of bigger hierarchies that underpinned social order in early modern England. So those kind of hierarchies within the home were really important. So that for the home to be ordered and well managed was a really important thing. And so any disruption to that created, a lot of anxiety. And I think in the kind of establishment of colonies in the New World, the kind of one of the most immediate things was the absence of homes, and I mean really the absence of any kind of material spatial infrastructure for society to replicate itself through, English society to replicate itself through. So establishing that material infrastructure was really important, and the home was one of the most important ways to do that. And Patricia Seed's done so much amazing work on this, and how the home was really the cornerstone of how English kind of identity established itself in the New World, and how their kind of claim to ownership of the New World was established. So when that space became threatened, it was huge in terms of how it impacted a sense of security and the establishment of English presence in the New World, and the immediate safety of the colonists, but also the kind of, I don't know whether safety is the right word, but the kind of English national identity or status on a kind of global scale. So the Jamestown Massacre was, I mean, I think uprising is a much better word for it, because obviously it was a reaction to the invasion of land, the very violent kind of invasion of land and killing of indigenous peoples in what is now North America. But yeah, it involved So Powhatan Indigenous Americans came into English settlements and killed a lot of the colonists, and some of those deaths occurred within the home, and that was quite an unsettling thing for the English colonists, who really saw those homes as quite fundamental to establishing their authority and what they perceived as their superiority in that space. It was kind of a really important for English national identity, but also as a material structure quite important for their physical safety, their shelter. And so I think that the kind of intertwining of the physical safety of the colonists and the kind of establishing of this dominance of English national identity in that space was created a large amount of anxiety when it was, you know, violated as it was represented at the time. But what was interesting is that in a lot of representations of, or English representations of that event, the home is really central to how it's represented, which creates this kind of odd, almost dichotomy of having to expose the fact that actually English colonists are really vulnerable out here, and we don't have this superiority that we claim to, we don't have this dominance that we claim to. But it was also there to, through the narrative that it constructed, to position the Powhatan, the kind of Indigenous Americans, as very transgressive, violent, unnatural in the way that they had attacked these English colonists in their home. So it was sort of a payoff of using the home to establish the fact that the colonists were victims, when of course that's absolutely not, you know, what they were really, and to establish then the Powhatan Indigenous Americans as these very violent, transgressive, unnatural murderers. So the home was really useful in that way, in the narrative of this event, but also at the same time it meant having to acknowledge the fact that actually the home doesn't always function as this bastion of social order and safety, which I think creates a really interesting kind of moment to look at how the home functions in early modern discourse and society.
That's absolutely fascinating, and that's so interesting for me to hear, because I've spent quite a lot of time thinking about specifically domestic spaces in early modern England and how they function in terms of instituting exactly the kind of order that you're talking about, and the sense of kind of shelter and physical safety and dominance, but dominance in terms of very local kind of patterns of authority, and the idea of the dominance of the householder. And all of that seems to be so rooted in both the idea that there are already many homes, so that even if some houses are being newly built, others are being extended or remodeled or changed based on these kind of ideals of, you know, what was known as the Great Rebuilding, and all these country houses being rebuilt to have a proliferation of private spaces. And all of that requires so much this assumption of England already being modelled on domestic space. So the idea of that being turned upside down by being in a new space where those spaces aren't yet created, but where that idea of authority is so associated with those spaces, is really fascinating, as is the idea of what you're saying about violence. And I suppose the thing I often end up thinking about is the violence and being associated with the home in terms of the authority the householder has over the home makes those within the home vulnerable to violence, because the householder controls the boundaries to the home, and if you're inside then you're vulnerable to that authority. So it's really interesting to hear you talking about this massacre or uprising sort of reconstituting the home in relation to the threat being outside the home, because suddenly those, I suppose, the boundaries that you expect to keep people out aren't functioning as a threshold. They're suddenly kind of opening up to these violent forces.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's some, again, in these representations of the massacre, to kind of give it its contemporary understanding, a name that represents that, there was also repeated in several different versions of that, the fact that the Powhatan came into English homes unarmed and they brought things to trade, which was a way of portraying this as, we were inviting them in, this was a kind of hospitable relationship, we trusted them. So it set it up to really represent a violation of that trust, to again represent the colonists as the victims and the Powhatan as these kind of, you know, unnatural murderers. But what it also did was force through that narrative to acknowledge the fact that the weapons which the Powhatan used were already inside the homes. So the means for that violence already existed inside the homes, which I think is, again, incredibly interesting when we're trying to, I mean, it breaks down that kind of dichotomy of inside order, safety, and outside threat, danger, because that becomes so blurred then. Where does the danger really exist, inside the home or outside it? And in The City Madam, the sort of play I used as a case study to look at this influence on kind of literature and narratives in England, that the fact that sort of Sir John, he's disguised as a Virginian Indian, it creates this wonderful kind of marriage of internal and external threat. And I think the play really interrogates how much can we really externalize the threat to this order, and how much does it already exist within the home. And I know when we sort of briefly discussed this before, I feel that there's such a, to me, when I'm reading now about, everybody's confined to their homes right now, we're being told, stay here, it's safe, this is a place that's safe for you, and you're keeping the rest of your community safe by being here. And again, there's this strong association with a kind of a moral duty to be within the home, and it's a civic duty to be within the home, duty to your loved ones and duty to your society as well. And so there's a very much a sense that it's a safe space, it's safe, keeps you safe, but you're also keeping other people safe by being inside the home. And it kind of externalizes a threat in a similar way. But actually, I'm reading all of these reports of massive spikes in domestic violence, and you think, well, really what it's also doing is exposing the threat that already exists inside the home, and that is often hidden in a way that I think it was in the early modern period as well, or attempted to be kind of hidden. Actually, within the home, threats exist as well. And it's a moment, like I think this Jamestown massacre was a moment that really exposed the vulnerability of the home and the threats within it. And I wonder whether something similar is happening now, that it's going to be pushed into the public consciousness a bit more, that actually the home is not a safe space for everybody at all. And that, I think perhaps literature has this great way of responding to these questions that are raised in moments of crisis. And I kind of hope or wonder whether, literature that's produced now and in the future will draw on these new conceptions of the home and start to ask really important questions about, how do we start to address the threats that already exist in the home.
Absolutely, yeah. And because I think you're right, that's such a kind of fascinating and such a painful parallel. The idea that, I think I was struck by what you were saying about the idea of weapons, domestic objects that already exist within the home becoming weapons. And I suppose the uncomfortable thing about, as you say, this ideal of stay at home as a moral duty that promotes safety being contradicted by the idea that you might be protected from infection within the home, but the other kinds of violence, you're kind of shutting the door and being trapped within. I mean, that really makes me think about what the threshold to the home means in terms of the crossing the threshold. Now suddenly we've got these kind of temporal boundaries in terms of time. We're allowed to go out for a sort of one walk a day if we're not, completely self-isolated, or and what that might mean for people who are no longer able to step outside the home, the protection, or to draw on a wider community, and the extent to even those one walk a day, the fact that we're kept distance from other people. I suppose everything I've thought about to do with the early modern home has been the combination of the privacy within the home and the embeddedness within the community, where you encounter people as soon as you're outside. And do you feel like the shift away from that is also one of the things that's sort of a shift away from the early modern, and also that's making people vulnerable in their homes today?
Yeah, I think there's obviously in the early modern period and now, the really interesting relationship between home almost as this discrete private unit, but of course it's connected really fluidly to community as well. And I actually thought as well that, there is this sense of people now being trapped within the home, and I think it's going to change everybody's understanding of their relationship to that space. But for people who feel the home is actually where they're most vulnerable, that's an incredibly scary position to be put in, and you can sometimes rely on community for support in that, to be able to reach out to a neighbour, to community support officer, whoever it is that you might be able to see outside the home. But I think the other thing that I really thought about in terms of relationship between home and community right now is community policing was a huge thing in early modern period, and how the home worked. And you're talking about thresholds and people crossing the thresholds, and that observing that crossing of the threshold, and how that really fed into community policing. And I think probably especially for women and women's behaviour outside or within the home was very reliant on that threshold and their position on either side of it. Things like bawdy courts, where often women's behaviour would be kind of brought up by other members of the community to be kind of judged. And I'm just thinking now, there are instances on social media, and even I think it's the Derbyshire police using drones to kind of, they're obviously literally policing, but people policing with their phones, taking pictures of people outside their home. You cross this threshold, and now all of a sudden, you're violating this like acceptable moral standard that has very recently been kind of brought into being.
Absolutely, yeah. And the irony so often of people outside the home policing other people for also being outside the home, kind of in that shared space. And you're right, that's incredibly early modern in terms of those bawdy courts, often relying on the testimony of I glimpsed so-and-so going into this person's house and coming out at this time. Absolutely. But I really liked what you said about the sort of almost the note of hope being that perhaps this time when we're all forced to kind of reconstitute our ideas of our home or what it means to be at home in such a dramatic way might bear fruit of sort of having us maybe think a bit more about what it means to be at home, and to question some of these inherited early modern ideas about privacy within the home, or what the boundaries of the home mean, or how moral authority relates to the home. And I wondered if we could sort of build on that with the final question that I've been asking in these videos, which is, what is literature? So do you think that literature has, you kind of hinted at this, has a key part to play in that sort of creating new visions for what the home can mean?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, that's a big question. And I think literature can be a kind of mediator between how we kind of understand our relationship to physical space and to the home. It's very much, and kind of the home is a material structure full of material objects, but it's also very ideological in its function. And I think literature can help us to sort of see and understand that. And I think our relationship to the home for everybody is changing right now, and how we understand it. And I think we're seeing things like the spike in domestic violence is awful. And I hope that people read these reports and recognize it, and perhaps that raises questions for people, like decenters their own understanding of the home and their relationship to it. And globally as well, social distancing is not possible for everybody. People's homes don't function the same in the UK, let alone globally. So hopefully it will raise questions about that. I suppose in a very idealistic way, I think literature does serve a function of kind of holding society to account. And so I hope, and I think you see it in early modern texts you return to, and it kind of forces you to confront questions that might otherwise have been forgotten about injustice or inequality, or people question things. Is it right the way that we're treating, even in the early modern period? I think there were questions that emerged in literature about whether it was fair, or whether it was right, whether it was moral, the way we're treating Indigenous American peoples. Is it right the way we treat common folk in England and their relationship to their lands? And I think that literature still has that kind of power to force us to address questions by writing about them in a way that makes us empathize with other people's positions, and it kind of will lock down those questions for us to return to in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. It will allow those really important questions to not be forgotten. It's at the moment, I feel like we're being forced to confront the fact that there is systemic or endemic violence against women and girls, and this moment is bringing that to surface. And if literature can capture that and force us to keep returning to that question of why does this still exist, why are we not doing something more to address that, it doesn't mean that the question will be answered straight away, but it will mean that we have to keep being confronted by those questions, and hopefully that will lead to us eventually solving them. I guess that's my idealistic hope for
Absolutely.
What literature could do.
Yeah, and that's a really lovely, hopeful note to end on. And I almost can't bear to end, because I feel there's so much to sort of unpack in what you just said. But just to kind of draw out a couple of the things, I think it's really interesting how I mean, I suppose all of your work, everything you've been saying, is sort of also interrogating what it means to be at home somewhere, both in terms of your literal space around you and in terms of the wider community and in terms of the nation, or a sense of, so the kind of domestic mapping onto your country as well as your kind of physical dwelling place. And then you're right, that question of because we've been talking about domestic violence and the way that the gendered aspect of that, and the fact that women are so often, female virtue has, in the early modern period at least, been so much constituted in relation to the home and staying within the home. That seems to resonate with so much of what you're saying. But I love the idea that if we just revisit all these questions, that this time could allow us to think through literature in a way that would let us question some of the assumptions we make about that. Yeah, that's a lovely sort of rousing call to arms to end on. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thank you, I've really enjoyed it. I wish we could keep going for longer. It was great, thank you.
I do as well. Yeah, well, okay, future domestic chats will have to happen.
Definitely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.